The phone rang at 7:30 p.m. Frank Sinatra was in his Palm Springs compound, waiting. His mother was supposed to arrive hours ago. When his assistant answered, Frank knew from the look on his face. The plane was missing. January 6, 1977. Dolly Sinatra was flying from Las Vegas to Palm Springs to visit her son. She did this trip regularly. She was 82 years old, but age hadn't slowed her down. Dolly was still the force of nature she'd always been. Strong, stubborn, fearless. The flight was supposed to take 90 minutes. Simple trip over familiar terrain. But a winter storm had moved into Southern California. Snow was falling in the mountains. Visibility was poor. The pilot should have canceled the flight. But Dolly Sinatra didn't like being told no. If Dolly wanted to see her son, she was going to see her son. The Learjet took off from Las Vegas at 5:20 p.m. There were 3 people on board: the pilot, the co-pilot, and Dolly Sinatra. The plane was supposed to land in Palm Springs at 6:50 p.m. Frank was waiting at the airport to pick up his mother. 6:50 came and went. No plane. 7 o'clock. Nothing. By 7:15, airport officials were making calls. By 7:30, they knew something was wrong. The plane had vanished. Frank's first reaction was denial. There's a mistake. The plane landed somewhere else. Maybe they diverted because of the weather. She's fine. She has to be fine. But as the minutes turned into hours, reality set in. The plane was missing. His mother was missing. And the mountains where the plane disappeared were brutal in winter. Freezing temperatures, heavy snow, steep cliffs. If the plane had crashed there, survival was unlikely. Frank immediately mobilized. He called everyone he knew: the FAA, the Civil Air Patrol, local police, search and rescue teams. He hired private helicopters. He offered money, lots of money, to anyone who could find his mother. By midnight, dozens of aircraft were searching the San Gorgonio Mountains. It was dangerous flying in the dark during a snowstorm, but Frank didn't care. Find her, he told the pilots. Whatever it takes, find her. Frank couldn't just sit and wait. He demanded to join the search. His security team tried to talk him out of it. Mr. Sinatra, you're 61 years old. The mountains are dangerous. Let the professionals handle this. That's my mother up there. Frank said, I'm going. To understand Frank's desperation, you need to understand his relationship with Dolly. She wasn't just his mother. She was the person who made Frank Sinatra possible. Dolly Martino was born in Italy, immigrated to Hoboken, New Jersey as a child. She was tough, ambitious, determined. She married Marty Sinatra, a quiet boxer turned fireman. And in 1915, she gave birth to Frank. The birth nearly killed both of them. Frank was over 13 pounds, a difficult delivery. The doctor focused on saving Dolly and essentially gave up on the baby. Frank wasn't breathing. They thought he was dead. But Dolly's mother grabbed the baby, held him under cold water, and Frank started crying. Frank always said his grandmother saved his life that day. But Dolly gave him everything that came after. Dolly ran the neighborhood. She was a Democratic ward boss, one of the most powerful women in Hoboken. She knew everyone, helped everyone, and everyone owed her favors. When Frank wanted to be a singer, Dolly made it happen. She used her connections to get Frank gigs. She bought him his first sound system. She drove him to auditions. She fought club owners who didn't want to hire him. Frank's early career was built on Dolly's determination and connections. And even after Frank became famous, Dolly remained involved. She wasn't a stage mother in the traditional sense. She was more like Frank's manager, advisor, and enforcer all in one. Dolly was also blunt, sometimes cruel. She disapproved of many of Frank's choices. She hated Ava Gardner, thought Ava was ruining Frank's life. She didn't like Frank's mob connections. She criticized his parenting, his marriages, his career decisions. Dolly never held back. Frank and Dolly fought constantly. Screaming matches that became legendary. But underneath the fighting was deep love. Frank knew everything he had, everything he'd achieved, started with Dolly. She believed in him when nobody else did. She fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. Now she was missing in the mountains, and Frank felt like he was losing the foundation of his entire life. The search continued through the night. Helicopters with searchlights combed the mountains. Ground teams hiked through snow, but the terrain was massive. The San Gorgonio Mountains cover hundreds of square miles. Finding a small plane in that wilderness was nearly impossible. By morning, Frank was on a helicopter himself. He convinced a pilot to take him up despite the dangerous conditions. Frank sat in the back, binoculars pressed his eyes, scanning the snow-covered peaks below. They flew for hours. Frank saw nothing but white. Snow, rocks, trees. No plane, no wreckage, no sign of his mother. On the ground, Frank joined a search party hiking into remote areas. He was 61 years old, not in great shape, struggling through deep snow at high altitude. His security team and search crew kept telling him to rest. Frank refused. "She's up here somewhere." Frank said, "I'm not stopping until we find her." The second night was the worst. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped below freezing. If anyone had survived the crash, they wouldn't survive another night in these conditions. Frank knew it. Everyone knew it, but nobody said out loud. Frank spent that night in a command center at the base of the mountain, surrounded by maps and radios. He chain-smoked, drank coffee, refused to sleep. Every time a search team radioed him with nothing to report, Frank's face got a little harder, a little older. By the third day, hope was fading. Search teams were exhausted. The weather was getting worse. Officials were starting to talk about calling off the search, at least temporarily. Frank exploded. "We're not calling off anything. She's up there. We keep looking. But Mr. Sinatra, we've searched thousands of acres. If the plane crashed in certain areas, we might not find it until spring when the snow melts." "Then we wait until spring." Frank shouted. "I'm not giving up on her." That afternoon, January 9th, 1977, a helicopter crew spotted something. Wreckage on a remote mountainside, nearly 9,000 feet up. It was difficult to reach, steep terrain, heavy snow, but it was definitely a plane. Frank was notified immediately. He insisted on going to the site. The search and rescue commander tried to stop him. "Mr. Sinatra, we need to secure the area first. We need to assess the situation." Frank's voice was cold. "That's my mother. I'm going." They flew him as close as they could. Then Frank and a small team hiked the final distance. The snow was waist-deep in places. Frank fell multiple times, got back up, kept going. When they reached the crash site, Frank stopped. The Learjet had hit the mountain at full speed. There was wreckage scattered across hundreds of yards. Parts of the fuselage, the tail section, pieces of metal and glass embedded in snow and rock. Frank stood there for a long moment, just staring. Then he started walking toward the main wreckage. The search and rescue team tried to stop him. "Sir, let us handle this." "You don't need to see." "I need to see," Frank said quietly. They found 3 bodies. The impact had been catastrophic. Nobody had survived. The pilot and co-pilot were in the cockpit area, and Dolly Sinatra was in the passenger compartment. Frank identified his mother's body. He didn't cry, not yet. He just stood there, looking at her, his face completely blank. One of the search and rescue team members later described the moment. Sinatra just stared at his mother for maybe 5 minutes. Didn't say anything. Didn't move. Just stared. Then he turned and walked away. About 50 feet from the wreckage, he stopped, fell to his knees, and started sobbing. Not crying. Sobbing. Like his whole body was breaking. Frank stayed on that mountain for another hour. He wouldn't leave his mother. The rescue team had to prepare to transport the bodies down the mountain, and Frank refused to go until they'd moved Dolly. The official investigation concluded that the pilot had become disoriented in the snowstorm. He'd flown into the mountain at about 500 miles per hour. Death was instant for everyone on board. They never knew what hit them. That was supposed to be a comfort. They didn't suffer. But it wasn't a comfort to Frank. His mother was dead. How it happened didn't matter. Dolly's funeral was held on January 12, 1977. It was a huge event. Dolly had been a prominent figure in Hoboken, and hundreds of people attended. Frank delivered the eulogy. He stood at the podium, looked out at the crowd, and tried to speak. My mother, Frank started, then stopped. His voice broke. He stood there for a moment, fighting for composure. My mother was the strongest person I ever knew. She built me. Everything I am, everything I accomplished, started with her. Frank paused, wiped his eyes. She drove me crazy. He continued. We fought constantly. She never let me get away with anything. She told me exactly what she thought, even when I didn't want to hear it, especially when I didn't want to hear it. The crowd laughed softly. Frank smiled through his tears. But she loved me, and she believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. When the world said I was finished, when Hollywood threw me away, when I had nothing, my mother said, "You're not done yet. You're going to come back." And I did, because she said I would. Frank's voice got quieter. I would give anything to fight with her one more time. To hear her tell me I'm doing something wrong. To see her roll her eyes at my choices. But I can't. She's gone. Frank stood there, tears running down his face. And I don't know how to exist in a world without her. He sat down, unable to continue. After the funeral, Frank's friends worried about him. He'd lost people before. He'd survived heartbreak, career failures, scandals. But losing Dolly was different. This broke something in Frank that never fully healed. Frank became obsessed with the crash investigation. He read every report, questioned every conclusion. He wanted to know exactly what happened, how the pilot had gotten lost, why they hadn't turned back, whether they'd suffered. The conclusion that they died instantly wasn't enough for Frank. He needed to know they hadn't been afraid, that his mother's last moments hadn't been filled with terror. Friends tried to help. Dean Martin called every day. Sammy visited regularly. They tried to get Frank to eat, to sleep, to take care of himself. Frank went through the motions, but the light was gone from his eyes. About a month after the crash, Frank returned to performing. He had shows scheduled, and Frank always honored his commitments. But everyone could see the difference. The spark was gone. Frank sang beautifully, technically perfect, but the joy wasn't there anymore. During one performance in Las Vegas, Frank was singing My Way. He got to the line, "Regrets, I've had a few," and his voice broke. He stopped singing, stood at the microphone crying. The audience sat in stunned silence. Finally, Frank apologized, said he needed a moment, and walked off stage. He came back 10 minutes later, composed himself, and finished the show. But afterward, friends found him in his dressing room, staring at a photograph of Dolly. One of Frank's closest friends later said, "Frank died a little when Dolly died. He kept living, kept performing, kept going through the motions. But a piece of him stayed on that mountain with his mother." In the years after Dolly's death, Frank talked about her often. He'd tell stories about growing up in Hoboken, about Dolly running the neighborhood, about how she'd fought for his career. His eyes would light up briefly during these stories, then dim again when he remembered she was gone. In 1982, 5 years after the crash, Frank was interviewed for a television special. The interviewer asked about his mother. "Tell me about Dolly Sinatra," the interviewer said. Frank smiled, but it was a sad smile. "My mother was a force of nature. She was tough, intimidating, impossible to argue with. She scared most people. But she loved fiercely. And if she loved you, she'd fight the world for you. You were close?" Frank nodded. "I was her only child. She poured everything into raising me. We fought like cats and dogs sometimes, but that didn't matter. She was my rock. Do you miss her?" Frank's eyes filled with tears. Every day, every single day. The interviewer, seeing Frank's emotion, moved on to another topic. But Frank brought it back. "You know what haunts me?" Frank said, "She was coming to see me. The only reason she was on that plane was because I'd invited her to Palm Springs. If I hadn't called, if I'd gone to see her instead, she'd still be alive." The interviewer tried to interrupt. "Mr. Sinatra, you can't blame yourself." "But I do," Frank said. "She died trying to reach me. How am I supposed to live with that?" There was nothing anyone could say to that. Frank Sinatra lived for 21 more years after his mother's death. He kept performing, kept recording, kept living his life. But friends said he was never the same. The edge was gone. The fire had dimmed. When Frank died in 1998, his family found something in his bedroom, a small box on his nightstand. Inside was a scarf that had belonged to Dolly. Frank had kept it since the crash. He'd held it every night before going to sleep. That's the true story of the day Frank Sinatra lost his mother. Not just lost her, but felt responsible for her death. The plane that crashed carrying Dolly Sinatra wouldn't have been flying if Frank hadn't called. That guilt ate at Frank for the rest of his life. The 3 days searching those mountains, finding the wreckage, identifying his mother's body. Frank Sinatra, the toughest man in show business, brought to his knees by grief. Dolly Sinatra built Frank. She made him who he was. And when she died on that frozen mountain, trying to reach her son, a piece of Frank died with her. He kept living, kept performing, kept being Frank Sinatra. But the man who climbed down from that mountain on January 9th, 1977, wasn't the same man who climbed up. That man had hope. The man who came down only had grief. And Frank Sinatra carried that grief heavy as snow for the remaining 21 years of his life.